Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Book Leads Impactful Books for Life and Leadership. I'm your series host and leadership performance coach, John Jaramillo. This podcast series is about getting to the books that have impacted the lives, the work, the businesses of my network. So these are great leads of people that I'll be interviewing to get to those books that have impacted them, influenced all those various areas, whether it is their work, their business, their life, all those worlds intersect. And in this series, I cover three categories of books. The first, where they're sharing with me a book that I haven't read. The second, where we're discussing a book we've both read, whether specifically for the series or read it in our past lives before the series. The third category is when I have the author and or publisher on to discuss the message that they want to get out there of the book that we're discussing. So today, my guest is Sean Harvey, and Sean is a TEDx speaker and founder of Warrior Compassion Men's Studio. Sean is an interfaith minister whose book, Warrior Compassion, Unleashing the Healing Power of Men, offers a roadmap for men's soul healing as a catalyst for systems change. Sean brings 25 years of experience in leadership and organizational development consulting and taught organizational behavior and change at Cornell, NYU, and Baruch College, City University of New York. His work focuses on deepening compassionate humanity into hypermasculine systems and developing leaders as emergent facilitators, compassionate bridge builders, and conscious change agents equipped to transform systems and heal cultures on a global scale. His current research focuses on facilitating bridges across polarized divides. And I met Sean a few years ago when he was a speaker at the Connects Exchange Forum. It's an online forum that I've discussed and talked about so many times on this series. During that program, I learned more about what he was doing, the work that he was into, and he also mentioned that he was going to be writing a book. My ears perked up, especially at that moment, especially because I can appreciate the topic, the urgency and the message that Sean has for men and the world at large when it comes to the work that he's doing. So I invited him here on the series. So Sean, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Sean, who are you today? Meaning, I read the bio, went through the highlights, but can you give me a little more about the work that you do day in and day out so that people get a flavor for who the guest is who's going to share the book with us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really on the spiritual path. It started when I left Wall Street at 40, went to work for Eileen Fisher, the women's fashion company. And there was a moment on my first day that changed the trajectory of my life, which is after an 8-month interview process, my two bosses sat me down and said, Sean, we just want to acknowledge that you have proven yourself in the interview process. We now want you to stop proving yourself and learn how to be who you actually are. When you interviewed with us, you showed us your heart and you showed us your polish. We hired you for your heart, and we want to see less of your polish. We want to see the real you. We want to see you unfiltered. And that really was a moment that, one was permission to look beneath the layers. And two, that a company, like in an organizational setting, there was a commitment to the human being, not the performer. And so that led to a 5-year journey at Eileen Fisher, which took me to an artist commune in Canada for 5 months to learn how to incorporate the arts, where I got the call to work with men. And while working at Eileen Fisher, I saw how men were being transformed through a culture that was 83% women. And men would often say, my wife, they would say what they were noticing, and it usually came through their wife or girlfriend. And they would say, my wife said, I listen differently. I'm more patient. I stopped needing to be right all the time, and I started to be more curious. I started to have more access to my full emotional expression. And I started to have a different level of creativity. And I was solving problems differently. But the most important thing every guy said was they felt more comfortable in their own skin. And I said, we got to bottle this. We got to bottle this and take it out in the world. And so basically up to that's what I wanted to share, because that's the motivation of seeing men being transformed through a different type of model or a different type of approach. seeing the power of healing in ways they don't even realize it's happening for them. And how it's impacting their lives, their relationships, their families, and their career, and their impact in the world. And that really set the stage for Warrior Compassion, the book I wrote.
So when it comes to the work that you do with those men, whether it's one-on-one coaching, group workshops, can you give me a little breakdown, I guess, of the various avenues you use to deliver that, to get that to the public, to those men, organizations, whoever it may be you work with?
So in the public arena, I've created something called Men's Soul Adventures. And so bringing men out on an outdoor adventure for about 3 hours, and I call it where outdoor adventure meets deeper male bonding, meets soul connecting conversations, either philosophical, existential, or spiritual awakening discussions among men. And so we might go hiking, we might go rafting, we might go kayaking, we might go rock climbing. And we started it in Washington, D.C. And the first day we launched it, 52 guys signed up within the first 24 hours. By the time I left DC 5 months later, we had 180 guys. We started to test it out in other cities, and within 4 days, we had 320 guys signed up. And so to me, it's there's a need. And how can we start to create this on a national level? The second thing, that I do one-on-one coaching for men around, often my pillars are authenticity, connection, and purpose. But really the work I've done throughout most of my career is helping folks find purpose, helping find folks connect with their values, and look at the ways that they can create impact in the world. The next piece, a group of us formed after, in 2020, something called Project Compassion, where we are deepening compassion in police departments. And we've just aligned with an organization that is committed to raising the number of women in police departments by 30% by 2030. So it's the 30 by 30 initiative, which is the Department of Justice sponsored initiative. And then I do consulting work. I'm an organization development consultant, and I bring in a systems thinker, and I bring this perspective of how can we transform organizational systems when we work with leaders in those organizations to learn how to be facilitators of the humanity-based conversations, to build compassionate bridges across division and polarization, and to be conscious change agents to think about new ways to transform systems that will have an impact on cultures.
Why don't you share here what you shared with me right before we recorded, or I hit record, about your trip down to DC and what's going to come out of that, if you could.
Yeah. So I've affiliated with an organization called Equimundo, and they're a DC-based NGO that focuses on masculinities and social justice. And they've just released last year the state of men in America, and they're really doing a lot of great research. And tomorrow we're going to be holding a conversation that essentially we're going to be looking at with a number of different partners. How do we divert young men from online messages by hate group extremists? In America, the study I heard, it takes 90 days to indoctrinate to the far right in America. And so how do we bring an alternative to some of that messaging, for healthy masculinity, for deeper compassion, for healing, and for breaking down the walls of isolation and disconnection that so many young men are experiencing today, and so many men across the board are experiencing? But if we can go to younger and younger, especially young men who are still figuring out who they are and how they want to be in the world and how they want to show up. And in an environment right now where especially a lot of white straight men are feeling attacked, or feeling that they have to change because something is broken, that we're sharing a message: you're not broken, but you might be wounded. And let's, as opposed to fixing the brokenness, let's talk about healing the wounds. And we don't often heal our wounds as men because we don't often have the tools or access to the communities or the environments, or we're navigating stigma, that any of these initiatives or efforts are a sign of weakness. And so how can we find strength in personal growth? How can we find strength in being connected from a place of deeper intimacy and deeper connection that is genuine and takes us out of the masks that we've put on, or what I like to call getting beneath the protective layers we've built based on the conditioning that we've internalized.
Sean, briefly, can you speak to your take on how we got there? Whether it's, going back a few decades, how society has evolved. What's your view? What are the words you use? What's your take on how men, young men in society got to where they are now? It doesn't have to go deep, but just, any insights you can provide.
Well, I often say it's, and a lot of my work is with the right, far right extremism. And I often say we've had toxic conditioning, and we've had faulty teaching. And so I think the messages we've received from our parents, from the church, from the media, from our peers, all of it is kind of looking at what does it mean to be a man. And I think, when we're born, we have everything within us. And then day by day, it gets stripped out, and then we become a shell of ourselves.
Yeah.
And so I think it happens so organically. It happens, it happens from the families we're born into, the communities we're raised in. But really, a lot of it happens in the schools we attend and among our peer groups. And, the expectations that are put on us that we have to mask. We can't. And, a lot of people will say it's the messages, you can't show emotion, you can't cry, you can't. But it goes way deeper than that. It goes way deeper than what we can't do. It's really the belief we have in ourselves. And one of the things that I think creates a lot of shame for a lot of men is that based on this messaging, based on this conditioning, we have an ideal version of what it means to be a man in our own minds. And often our shame comes from the place of when we don't live up to that expectation, that's where our shame breeds. We're less than, we're not good enough, we're not man enough, we're not this, we're not that. And I think it's within that shame and the fear to tap into that shame that is often where a lot of the challenge happens. And that's, my book is called Warrior Compassion. It's not called Compassionate Warrior. I'm not asking men to be a compassionate warrior because that's not the identity that all men want to claim. And it's not necessarily the path that all men need to claim to be a compassionate warrior. However, warrior compassion suggests that there is an amplifying force of the compassion that's within us to be courageous and curious enough to look within to heal the wounds that are holding us back. And it's an energy within each of us that is accessible for every man. And then from looking at who we are beneath the protective layers, we can then determine the type of man we want to be. And for some, that may be to be a compassionate warrior, but it's not for me or anyone to say what a man should be. We have so many messages out there saying this is what a man should be. And I often argue, let's stop saying what the answer is and start creating a set of questions for men to be in their own inquiry, to discover their own truth of who it is that they are, that reflects their journey, that honors who they are, and that moves from a place of self-loathing of the ways that they're not measuring up to self-love for gratitude for who they are.
Yeah, I think that's amazing how you distinguish between warrior compassion and compassionate warrior. I love that differentiation. I love how it kind of destigmatizes that belief that vulnerability and opening up is weakness. It's not asking you to put down your armor necessarily,
Right.
but just how you think about your tactics and what you need to get done. So I think everything you cover is needed. Everything you cover is beautiful because um, you see it amplified in the last, I don't know, obviously there's been so much turmoil, but you see a lot of it amplified, especially in the last 5 to 10 years. Um, and if you, even without being in your field, even without being in your business, I speak to different men. I speak to classrooms, um, and yeah, there is kind of like this, I don't know. It's kind of like it's hard for men and boys to find their place in things because society has changed so much. The rule of the role of the man has changed a lot, in the last 50 years. Um, and then obviously applied to that is the moniker of toxic masculinity. It's amazing how I've heard allies of men of different backgrounds saying, you guys are getting a bad rap because of um, who's been in power for as long as we can remember, alongside with the predators that are in the news all the time.
Right.
But every men are seen as kind of like a segment, just one group. So it's kind of applied to all of you. So it's good to see that. But, conversations like these, groups like yours, where you can
Right.
kind of open up and talk about what it is you need to discuss. Um, it's good because I do see more honesty. I see more raw honesty. I see
Right.
more vulnerability. People are open. And when you can do that, I've seen it, I've experienced it myself. When you can talk about where you really stand, where you really are,
Right.
what you really want, what you really need, when you can express that, that's a heavy boulder off your shoulders. That's a heavy boulder off your chest. You feel like you can breathe. And as much as I understand all of this, everything I've just said, and I've experienced it, even still, it's hard for me to express things that I need in the day to day. So it's a proactive, intentional exercise where you kind of have to remember what your needs are.
Yeah, I want to tap into a couple things you just said. I think one of the things that I help in organizations, men and male leaders in organizations, is navigate the shifting rules and roles around gender, the messaging around masculinity, and the dynamics around power. Because all of it's shifting. And to your point, I think it's been shifting for, you shared 50 years, but definitely in the last decade alone,
Oh yeah, yeah.
we've seen extramental shifts. And I think, from a social justice perspective, you hear men need to change because in the pursuit of justice, we can often forget that there's a human condition at play, that we're not just shifting behavior, that it's also heart opening work. To get to the heart opening work, first we have to just say, um, we don't ask men enough. So how are you navigating? How are you reacting? What are you thinking? What are you feeling with all these changes? We're not asking men that question. We're demanding change without, or change in an applied way, even if it's as allies. It's not asking men about their own experience. Now, I just got out of a relationship with an ultra conservative MAGA Republican. And I'm not MAGA, I'm very much ultra progressive, uh, queer New Yorker. And in that, I learned a lot in that relationship about, you know, on the different sides of the political spectrum, how we see this work. Across the board, men are suffering regardless of political affiliation, right? The pathway in might look a little different. If we're taking a progressive view, a moderate view, or a more conservative view, or an extreme view. But what I've found is what's universal is we can really talk about the ways men suffer in silence that has no political affiliation. Be it, um, to your point, not, what are the reminders we need of our own humanity? What is our access to feeling and the ways that we've been blocked in being able to feel or express emotion? What are the ways that we feel isolated and alone in the world? What are the ways that we have been playing the game, got the prizes, and are still feeling empty? What are the ways that the shifts around us are happening so fast and no one's taking the time to ask, how are we doing? You know? And I think that's part of what, when we go to places of, like, say, hate group extremism, there's a place for men to sit. There's a place for men to see themselves. There's a place that there's a certain type of acceptance and tribalism in it. And what we haven't found is what are some other acceptable ways to find that sense of community among men that meets the tribal needs, that breaks down the barriers of isolation, but also allows an open-heartedness in that brotherhood.
Yeah, I think you summarized it perfectly. Because I think anytime I come up against those feelings in myself or in conversations that I have with others, and I mean, through these conversations on this series, you talk about all different kinds of things similar to this. This comes up every once in a while. But I mean, I just keep going back to that primitive mindset where the men serve this purpose as the leaders of the pack and the providers and this and that. And it's not to say that it has to go back to that at all.
Right.
That's one thing I want to get clear when I'm speaking about it is the men were like that for so long, seen in that role for so long. Things are shifting, right? Other groups are rising. That's completely fine. But when that mentality has been there so long, we don't need to go back to that. But it's like, okay, so what can we tap into that's different? So what is our place? What does that look like? What can we do? It's incredible to think about, and I always think of everything in that primitive mindset. Why do things feel a certain way? It's weird. I think you just mentioned something along the lines of, like, when you get to, I'm paraphrasing, when you get to success, when you get to a certain level and still feel that discomfort. For me, it's reaching my level of success and not having to fight anymore. So it's kind of like things are relaxed. There isn't an urgency that existed before. So that's it kind of makes you unfurl a little bit where you don't have that pressure on you. So I'm just always thinking of it in that primitive mindset of that fight, that constant need to protect. And when that goes away, when you don't have that, when things are secure, it's kind of like idle hands, idle minds.
Right.
You're seeking what that next thing is that's going to fill that. But in no way would I ever say we need to get back to that. It's not about taking. I think that's why a lot of men don't talk about certain things, and we vocalize that as much. Is they're afraid to step up and say they're afraid because they figure if I step up and say that I need resources or I need help, it's taking away from another group, especially those that have been disadvantaged for so long. And I'm seen as, you've been in the lead, you've been at the top for so long. How is it that you need help, kind of thing? So I think this kind of conversation puts out there, yes, we may need help, but it's not a zero-sum game. We're not trying to take away from anybody else.
Well, I want to spin off what you're saying in even a little bit of a different direction. I want to talk about, because as you're talking about leadership, I want to talk about male leadership, because I think one of the things that we underestimate is how lonely it gets as leaders the higher you go. You're shouldering the burden because our traditional hierarchy, adds all that responsibility. You're shouldering the burden. Your peers may not be your collaborators. Your peers may not allow you to be vulnerable because you may work in very competitive environments or cutthroat environments where vulnerability is not necessarily always valued, or it can be weaponized. And then flip side of it, in the work I do with police, military, firefighters, what have you, to ask for help can be a sign of weakness, and that vulnerability can be seen as problematic, you know, and it can be a measure of fitness. And I always say in this work, when we're talking about men's healing, men's growth, men's transformation, the two things we can't do: one, we can't victimize men. The victimization of men will be a deal breaker for many men.
Mm-hmm.
But the other part of this is we also can't emasculate men in the process. As some of the processes we're seeing in organizations are feminizing, as we are becoming, you know, more open-hearted, you know, balancing strength with tenderness, you know, adding care into the mix. How to be able to support men to navigate, how to be more emotional, how to be more creative, how to tap into more of their, you know, for lack of a better word, their yin or their feminine,
Mm-hmm.
without emasculating them and doing it. And really looking at it as the integration of our whole selves, the reclaiming of the parts we've denied or we've rejected, does not weaken us, does not feminize us, does not emasculate us. It actually strengthens us because we are more agile
Mm-hmm.
to be able
Perfect
to
word.
meet life on life's terms and to meet the demands that are happening in organization after organization, because we are in some of the most challenging times of our lifetime, of our generations, in terms of the volatility, the uncertainty, the you know, how do you plan? You know, back in the day, we would do 5-year, 10-year strategic plans. Then it became like 3 years, then 2 years. Now it's like, what do we do in 6 months? You know, and
Yeah.
how do leaders trust themselves enough and trust their teams to be able to navigate through really volatile, uncertain times? And so for men who are not having access to a lot of what they need, what is their ability to trust as opposed to micromanage? What is their ability to offer really more progressive, you know, family care practices, work-life balance practices, remote practices, without feeling the need to have that control or that fear? I think for so many men, it's the fear of losing control. And I think because so much is packed in, we're often so tightly wound that to deviate from that and to release is actually, I think, because it's so unfamiliar and so foreign, and the feelings can be so overwhelming, that it's really what I find is a fear of losing control, a fear of not being in control, which I think is what we have, part of how we've been conditioned, not just to lead, but to keep everything in check.
Hmm. Sean, when it comes to you, and thank you for everything you shared, even before we got into the meat of this conversation. When it comes to you, what did your path to now look like, beginning at the point where you step into education or step into the workforce? From then to now, what did that look like? I'm always curious, my guest history. What was it that led them to do the work they're doing now, to write the book they're doing now? So, what did that path look like for you?
So for me, I think part of it was having a mother who said you can be anything, but not in a way to entitle me, but she just believed in me, in terms of, and she knew my rebellious nature, that I would just figure it out on my own. When I was 15, I came out as a gay man. At 16, I started a gay and lesbian youth group for the city of Dayton, Ohio. That served, now still today, 35 years later, still, you know, serves 80 youth at any one time. When over the course of my, you know, I was ostracized, I was bullied, I had no friends in elementary, junior high, high school. I was in like suburban / rural Ohio. So I think for me, there's just always been this like inner strength, inner engine that I just step into the face of adversity and have a rebellious spirit to it. So I started that group. In my 20s, I really leaned into the life of the hypermasculine. I was as butch as I could be. I was as muscular as I could be. I had as much sex as I could have to validate my insecurities, right? And on paper, I looked great. Physically, I looked great. Inside, I was empty as hell. You know, I was at 28 after 9/11. I just moved to New York after 6 months before 9/11. I was unemployed for a year. I was homeless. I was in my addiction. And there was something I was noticing that, you know, when I was chasing money, status, career ambition, I would fall flat on my face within 6 months. When I would go back to that experience of starting the gay and lesbian youth group, that's when I would circle back and go, but what am I really about? And I would listen to the inner voice. And I'm like, I'm about service. And so, you know, my life, I soon after I got a job at Banana Republic, and then a friend of mine in recovery said, hey, we're hiring at this university. I got the job on the spot, became a director within a week, and then became a college professor within 3 weeks. Started at Baruch, then went to Cornell, and then NYU. So my life changed in an instant. My 30s was really then, so I was in the hypermasculine. I was at the depths of despair. In my 20s, really, I think from being wounded in my teens, in my early years. In my 30s, I started to heal. I became the vice president of a consulting division, where I created something called socially conscious leadership for Wall Street emerging talent. And then on my 40th birthday, gave up that role because I lost my heart and my soul in the work. And that's when the job at Eileen Fisher came along, and those 5 years changed the course of my life and put me on the path to working with men. And, you know, I say this, I say my struggles with addiction, I say my struggles with sex and drugs. I talk a lot about my ego and that need for validation, that need for my career was my identity. You know, I didn't have a personal life because I had such a rich professional life and great resume. And what I talk a lot about is no matter how successful we become, if we have not invested in our personal lives, in our relationships, in self-love, then we're really building a house with no foundation. And it can come tumbling down at any point, and we can lose it all. And I've seen a lot of men, successful men, lose it all because they didn't build a solid foundation from the beginning. And so for me, this journey has been a lot of lived experience. I think the work with men is coming from my own experience. And I think as a gay man who works primarily with straight men and primarily in conservative far-right environments or hyper-masculine systems, we just bring a different perspective. We bring a different perspective of the balance of the masculine and feminine. We bring a different perspective around inclusion. We have a different feel and experience as men around oppression. And so as a white man who looks like me, who has a look that could have been on January 6th, you know, at the same time, I understand oppression. I've done the work. And when people ask me how I can do this work, I say, because I've done my work. I can see whoever is in front of me. I can see their humanity. even if I don't agree with or abhor their views. And they could abhor mine, but when we can see each other's humanity, we can start to figure out a new way forward in terms of how we be in relationship together, how we see each other. And then we can start to have thoughtful conversations about the places we disagree. But I think right now we're so polarized that we just see the issues, we don't see the human. And I think a lot of times on both sides, or on different sides of polarized divides, we're waiting for the fight, or we're waiting for the objection, or we're waiting to be wronged. And when we don't bring that, and we bring non-judgmental, open-hearted curiosity without bringing an agenda of the issue, but just, I'm curious, what do you believe? What do you value? And to start to say, a lot of times our values are more aligned than we think. We just have just moved in such different ways that we have different packaging that society is telling us one is right and one is wrong, depending on what side we're on.
Yeah, it's incredible how people, I was going to say communicate, but it's really that they don't, whatever the topic of the day may be. If you're looking at mainstream media, they bring on somebody from this side, they bring on somebody from that side, and they hit the usual talking points, and then they get off TV. But I think in a conversation that you and I had previously, we talked about how, and I think it stemmed from the work that you've done. You've gotten in front of these people that are kind of like the polar opposite of your views, dated somebody that was on the other side of those views, where it's kind of like when you have the face-to-face conversation, it may not be easier, but it's much easier than those high-level conversations that you see in the media, that we stick to our values. But if we were in front of each other, talking to each other one-on-one,
right,
not influenced by any other group or colleague of yours' reaction, just one-on-one, what can happen when you really have a real conversation with people. But I mean, we just don't, there's keyboard warriors going out there, just kind of living in their echo chambers, standing for something, fighting for something. For me, again, that there's that primal lens, like it's just in our, somebody on here said, no, they didn't think that was the case. But to me, I think it is in our nature to want to react. Not everybody, because we've evolved differently. We're not all living in the same tribes and whatnot. We don't all have the same mentality, but deep down inside, I think it's in our nature to need to use our energy in some way. Instinct is to fight. Instinct is to defend yourself. Instinct is to stand for something. So when you think about those people that are spewing hate and whatnot, and they're out there vocalizing these thoughts, it's just incredible how they're just hitting those talking points and using that energy, where there are people like, admittedly, me and you, where it's like, we may have our thoughts, we may have our passions, those energies we want to get out, not like them, but we're being more thoughtful about how we do it. Because again, it comes down to emotional intelligence, controlling what you're emoting, controlling what you're showing, understanding what the result may be if you say the wrong thing, but trying to bring people together and learn from each other.
Can I take it a little deeper though?
Yeah.
I think, when I often move from emotional intelligence to emotional literacy, and I also want to make clear, when I look at this now, when I talk about extremism, I'm talking extreme on the left and the right.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't think there's a monopoly on one side or the other. It just, but I think what is really present for me, and just even looking at some of these divides, is the role fear plays into the mix, right? And in order for us to even identify the emotions we have or access the emotions we have to understand the wounds that trigger and activate us to move us into fight response or flight response. or that people-pleasing response, but we are doing something because we are not in touch with the wounds and the core tapes that we have been living by from young ages, that are the places where we can act out, the places where we can get activated. And so I think what we are often seeing is not just about emotional intelligence, because I think many of us can identify our emotions at this point. It's to understand the wounds that are activating certain emotions where we become, reactive versus thoughtfully responding. And so I think when the way I think so many things happen on the right and the left, there's just so much fear.
Mm.
I often know that as a progressive, many of my progressive brothers and sisters cannot do what I do. Either it's something that it's either a fear, it's an anger, it's a rage. And we are really good at talking at or talking about the other. Very few of us are actually engaging with each other.
Mm. Absolutely.
And I think that's the work, that's the bridge building work of how do we move from talking about, talking at, or being in our rightness and our righteousness around an issue, that we're not coming from a place of curiosity to even say, what if I have it wrong? What if my view isn't the right view? Because reality is we're talking about core belief systems and the core value systems that are being challenged at this point. There is no right or wrong. There is my ex, he was very right in his beliefs because that was his belief system.
Mm.
My belief system is very different. Until we started to understand what we both valued, we were still in this issues thing, as opposed to bringing it deeper. Say, oh, this is how you see the world, this is how I see the world, from that place. Now, if we take the fear out of the equation and say, now, how do we hold this from love? How can we have a different conversation around the places that we disagree around, or that we don't see eye to eye around? How do we still love each other in the process? And that was the work that my ex and I did. That's what the work that happens when I connect with folks who are not like me. I'm not holding an agenda that my view. And I even said, at one point, I'm like, I'm not trying to change your political view. I don't really care. What I'm curious about is the anger with which you hold that view. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about the emotion that we're holding this. If we were to just do a pause on any issue and get out of the over-intellectualization that we do, and the rightness that we need to be, because that's what our culture says, and pay attention to what's happening in our body, what's happening emotionally, and let's talk about that. That is another way to humanize each other, because then we're being human together. We're not holding a particular view that we have to sway the other side.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you and I talked about that a couple of weeks ago, just putting down that fear, how much it drove conversations nowadays. Like we feel like something is being taken away from us, and obviously we're gonna react like a cornered animal if we believe somebody's trying to change something about us, take something from us. So I appreciate that view. Absolutely. Sean, does it make sense from your childhood that this is what you're doing today? I'm always fascinated by who somebody was as a child and how that essence of who they were, whatever they may have been back in the day, plays into the work that they're doing today. How do you reconcile that?
No, it's funny. The moment I got the call at the Artist Commune in Canada, we were doing a visualization on Sunday morning. And as we were in the visualization, my entire life flashed before me. And I just got this acknowledgement. I've been uniquely designed in this lifetime to do this work. So as a boy, I was a very feminine, with a high-pitched voice. People couldn't tell if I was a boy or a girl. I had like 7 cowlicks, I had this curly hair, I was, you know, and then I was ostracized, and I think I think those of us that are are ostracized, that are left out, we get a very interesting perspective on the world because we're not on the inside. And I think at a certain point we just don't give a shit, right? About fitting in and conforming. And that's often, I think, where some of the nonconformist folks come from, is feeling like they're on the outside. But you also see the world because you become hyper vigilant around danger, and you start to read people in different way. And I think it develops a different type of intuitive knowing, right? And so all of these pieces, I think, contributed to having to, and I should also say, I was supposed to be a 3rd generation long haul trucker. So my grandfather hauled steel for the big 3 and was served under General Patton in World War II. My father served in Vietnam. My father was a long haul trucker for 43 years. Queer minister, professor was probably not on the radar. But so I think we're also grappling with, what does it mean to be a man when we don't fit into the norm, right? And so bringing that perspective, and then, we're often doing additional healing work because we're brought up in a way that we are told we're wrong, or that we are hated because of the way we are different, right? And it varies for, everyone's experience in the LGBTQIA plus Two-Spirit community. We, each of us has our own experience, but I don't think any of us can come out of the coming out process unscathed, right? So we have another level of wounding, or multiple levels of wounding, that go on to just being men or human. So I think that those pieces inform how I think about, and then having the experience of Wall Street to Eileen Fisher to police and military to seminary, and having been in organization development for 25 years and been a college professor. All of these different experiences inform how I see the healing of men, but also how I see the healing of men connected to systems change and societal systems change, and how do we transform on a global level.
Sean, a few things. How and when did you end up on Wall Street? And I'll jump to the next question. Go ahead.
So when I worked for the consulting firm where I was the head of the division, most of their clients were Wall Street firms. So I was a Wall Street consultant. So okay. I worked primarily with Wall Street firms and big media in New York.
Okay. And then how and when does the ministry play into your career, your path? When did that happen? Why did it happen? Why are you grinning?
That's an awesome question, actually. So I wasn't raised religious. I mean, I had religion around me, but my parents, they didn't want me to be raised in the Catholic Church. My mom was Catholic. My father was not.
Why did they say that? Well, why did they believe that?
My mom went to Catholic high school, or Catholic elementary and junior high, and she didn't want me to have that experience. She wanted me to be in public school. But then I went to 3 Catholic universities. So, go figure. But my second master's is in existential psychotherapy. All about the meaning of life, all about our relationship to how do we live in relation to death.
That explains a lot.
Right?
Explains a lot about, yeah. Okay.
So organization development was, how do I help contribute to changing the world? Right. I chose a process of change management, organizational change, as a way to be a change agent. Right. But I wanted to do it in nonprofits, and I wanted to do it around social impact from the very beginning. Then I studied existential psychotherapy to really get into the, and what I, in my
That
world,
sounds like existential psychotherapy sounds like some heavy shit.
yeah,
That sounds heavy.
right. So I've always been the meaning of life guy. Like, I want to have the meaning of life conversations, right? I mean, my friends call me the philosopher. So that's just how I think. That's just, and so and so in my work, I bring 4 existential questions to every engagement. Who am I? Why am I here? What am I here to do? And how do I love? And that follows my model of authenticity, purpose, and connection. So you could really say it as authenticity, purpose, mission, and connection.
Mm-hmm.
So then when I got to Eileen Fisher, we had Akashic Records readers. We had, which is like getting your soul DNA alignment, conversations with spiritual masters.
What kind of company is that? And I
Eileen
apologize.
Fisher is a women's fashion company. It's a conscious women's cat. It's a very progressive women's fashion company, very sustainable. Really was setting the stage for sustainability in the fashion industry at the very onset.
Gotcha. Thank you.
And Eileen holds a commitment to personal transformation. I ultimately became the head of personal transformation and well-being for the company. And so I also co-authored an article for the Journal of Management, Spirituality, and Religion called Nurturing the Soul of the Company at Eileen Fisher. And in that, we asked employees, what do you consider the soul of the company? And the overwhelming response was, well, it's Eileen. It's her values. It's her belief system. She set the stage. But there was a comment that really stood out to me, which was, Eileen believes in the deep intuitive knowing and values it more than empirically based data. And she turned $350 into a half a billion dollar company on that intuitive knowing. Of course there was data, but it was the value of creativity, the organic, the simplicity were valued way more than the data. And so it flies in the face of a lot of how other organizations operate. And for every guy that came into the company where the metrics didn't hold the same weight as being in the process and being in the unknown, that took an adjustment for every guy, every type A person that was hired by the organization to let go of what they'd learned in business to be able to surrender into this culture.
Okay, so at what point ministry?
So when I got the call to work with men, I had left Wall Street to never have to work with men again. So I knew this was on a pay grade way beyond me. And I knew it was a spiritual path. And I was being surrounded by spiritual teachers in a company environment. And I said, and then a minister at one point that was at my church said, I think there's a seminary for you. And it was One Spirit Interfaith Seminary where I went. And the moment I stepped in for the open house, I knew it was home, and I enrolled that day and went on a 2-year journey to become an interfaith minister.
Oh, amazing. And then I guess the other question.
I'll just say this. And I knew that if we were going to create societal systems change that began with helping men heal, the healing had to be at the deepest level possible. So soul healing is why I say it's a roadmap for soul healing in the book, because this isn't a psychological job. This is a soul healing job to get one connected to their ultimate truth.
Sean, in asking about your ministry work, you mentioned your second master's degree. What were your other degrees?
So my undergrad was industrial and organizational psychology. My first master's was organizational development. Then my second master, and I have a graduate certificate in public service administration.
So what was it that leaned you towards that path of organizational development and understanding? What was it that kind of triggered you to go in that direction?
I took an org behavior course in college and fell in love with it. And it kind of brought all the ideas that I had as someone who kept changing majors. And finally, it was a place to balance change, impact, values, and yet still being able to make a living.
Love it.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And from that place, from an IO Psych degree, then I actually started out in the master's in public service administration. And by the third class, I didn't find a cause that moved me enough to want to be an executive director. But then I took another org behavior course in my third class was another org behavior class. And I was like, oh, wait, what if I learn a process that can help many nonprofits? So build the tools. And that's really what I'm doing now in my facilitation model, what I call the Symphonia method, which is building a process for facilitative leadership that can be embedded in any organization that in its design helps deepen compassion, humanity, vulnerability, authenticity. Because in order to facilitate in a way that gets the best out of groups, you need to embrace these concepts of how do we create a space that's vulnerable? How do we create a space that's compassionate? How do we create a space that's transformative and healing? And so on a micro perspective, we're learning the tools we need to hold the spaces we need to hold. And in that learning, you have to look at yourself. You need to mirror back your own ability and your own blocks to be able to be with what you're trying to create in the space. So it makes it accessible, practical, and tangible, as opposed to this esoteric idea that many of the practices out there we espouse, but yet don't create traction because it's still hard to integrate, internalize, and manifest.
Sean, what does leadership mean to you? How do you define it? What does great leadership look like?
I believe great leadership starts with personal transformation. It's coming into loving yourself and your humanness, and being able to see that in order to inspire others, that level of vulnerability, that level of transparency, that level of integrity, that level of personal accountability, those are qualities and characteristics that people will look up to, respect, and be willing to follow. And I think when we go the more superficial route of leadership development, in many cases, we're learning how to behave, we're not learning how to be.
Big difference.
Right. And so I think the more we can do the work on how do we be, our natural leadership skills will then start to manifest, but they'll manifest from a different place of integrity and awareness.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I believe that's always the first place to start, and to look at what are the wounds we haven't addressed that are getting in the way of us being able to see the people that follow, the people that we are guiding, the people that we are leading in their humanity, in their humanness, as opposed to just seeing them as performers.
Yeah, cogs. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sean, now let's jump into the book. If you could introduce the book, and what is it that led up to you putting it out there and publishing it?
I knew I wanted to write a book at some point, and the book really became part memoir, part, I think for me, the motivation was my journey has been so crazy and so profound that I had to write about it. But as I was writing the book, it became less about my journey and more about what are the aspects of my journey that could be helpful for other folks. So I really, and the book opens with, the story of my father and I healing our relationship. Then we move from that to what is the state of men today. And then I share in 2 chapters my journey over the last 10 years from the day I resigned from the consulting firm to like 48, 49. And this journey I've been on to help men heal. But ultimately the work I've done to heal myself. And I've tapped into so many different healing modalities along the way that I thought, there's a number of healing modalities that could become like a smorgasbord for men to be able to say what feels right for them. And because some of them are so foreign to many of us, what might they try? What might they experiment with? What might they reflect on to just get them out of their own status quo? I think this is all about levers, right? If we shift one lever, that can change the trajectory of the path we walk. We change multiple levers, that can change from 45-degree to 90-degree perspective on the path.
Mm-hmm.
So being able to have access points, and so it's not the guide, it's a roadmap. And this roadmap is based on my experience and other men I've spoken with, and then organizing it in a way, and then bringing a level of spirituality and compassion into the mix. And one of the things I did in the book, we can often say, well, compassion is weak, right? So I define compassion from 7 or 8 different faith traditions to say, here's a spiritual foundation in all these different faith traditions, in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism, in Sufism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism. In these different faith traditions, compassion is always part of the mix, right? So it has a strong foundation that is not weak. If we translate it back to Jesus did not demonstrate weakness in the way that he walked his path. For those that believe in the Christian faith or in the teachings of Christ. Muhammad, same thing. There's still a level of compassion that is embedded both in the spiritual leaders, as well as in the faith itself. And so being able to have that as a root and an access point. And then just say, now how do we come into our own level of compassion? How do we heal the wounds that hold us back from being compassionate? How do we heal the wounds that hold us back from truly loving, receiving and loving? And I think last, many of us have learned love with conditions. How do we start to live a life of unconditional love for ourselves and others? And how do we live a life of forgiveness for those who can't love us because of their own wounding?
So, Sean, when it comes to the environments that you work in, where, yes, they might be hyper masculine, and yeah, I'm going to generalize here. What is the reaction when you bring up compassion, when you bring up these approaches that they may not have considered, that it's not instinctual?
Right.
I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's not instinctual right away, right off the bat to men, especially in those areas in which you work. What was the reaction? How do they come around? Do they come around? What does that look like when you bring it and share it with them?
First we have to get creative. I think one of the things we often can do is we can act like coaches or therapists when we come into these conversations, and that's going to check people out right away. Because this isn't a heady conversation. This isn't an intellectual conversation. And one of the things we have to do when it comes to compassion is move from an intellectualizing compassion to internalizing the visceral experience of compassion. We need to feel it, right? And so we need to bring in creative processes that allow us to feel. You know, one of the places we often start is storytelling, right? And one of the things that I do in the book, and I do in the experiences, is first I start with, let's talk about the state of men. Let's talk about the ways men are suffering in silence. And when we start rattling off what those are, and I shared some of them earlier, men start to nod. They start to see themselves in it. You know, it's funny when my ex-boyfriend read my book, he's like, "How'd you know my story?" I'm like, "Because you're a dude. You're not that unique.
Yeah.
We're not that unique when it comes to some of the stuff. We've been given the same game plan of how we need to operate to succeed as men. What we don't understand is the unintended consequences of the suffering that it creates for us by our lack of ability to access our emotions, by the intimacy we yearn for and the sex that we settle for, by the career-driven approaches we take for success, and the sacrifices we make to be successful. Our internalized homophobia that prevents us from creating real world friendships with other men, where we're moving from competition or fear of other men because we might be considered gay if we are too close or too intimate or express too much. And we're often have been taught to accept versus get curious. Accept the norms we've been given as opposed to get curious about where do they come from. So I think, you know, bringing this in, I think it's just having these types of conversations. It's not coming in that I have the answer, that I have the answer for you of how you need to show up, but I have the questions. I have experiences and exercises that allow you to access your truth without even realizing it, because you're using the arts, or you're using storytelling, or you're using song, dance, whatever it is, to access your inner wisdom, or movement in the body, or contemplative practice like mindfulness. These things allow us to access in different ways. And then I think the other piece is that we're introducing the experience of these men. I think when we talk about men's experiences, we're often talking about how men need to change. Or we're talking about, you know, how to be an ally, or how to, you know, get in check with your privilege and your power. That's important work. But before we get to that work, I often believe we have to get to the compassion work first. We have to get to the heart opening and ego relaxing work, so that whatever work we need to do beyond that, it's more accessible and we are more equipped to hold it without being a knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, I think that's important too, because you don't want men to misperceive or misbelieve that they have to drop whoever or whatever they are completely and start from scratch.
Right.
You know, you want to tap into who they are, really have an honest conversation with themselves. A lot of that self-work you talk about, but I think that's a great point to bring up, is this isn't a cue that you have to start over. You have to give up who you are genuinely, authentically, what you really want to demonstrate, what you really want to show. I can imagine there's the majority of those men were ready, had that compassion internally, but we're just waiting for an opportunity or permission to bring that forward.
With two things, you know, one, you know, if we go to what you were just saying, if you have to start over, then that's in a shame spiral, because that suggests there's something wrong with you and something that you need to fix, right? But if we're saying this is just amplifying who you already are, because I think what a lot of men have struggled with, the one thing that I hear, especially when we talk about like the father wounds, mother wounds too, but really the father wounds, the level of the number of men who are operating from a place of low self-worth, of not being enough. That is something we don't talk about. And it's something that can create an overactive ego to sell you on who they are because they can't give that to themselves, give it to themselves. Right? The guy who can be obnoxious in the workplace. You know, we can say, he's being obnoxious, or we can say his inner child wasn't seen.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he needs to be able to really calm so that he knows that he's good enough now and he doesn't have to keep trying to prove himself. Right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Like anytime I hear, and you had mentioned it before, but anytime I hear anybody who is overacting, overreacting, or you can just tell they're trying to be extra or whatever it may be, whatever they're trying to share. It is amazing through the course of my learning, my education, my work, these conversations, how exactly as you said, you know, when they're acting in a certain way that's not conducive to building bridges and engaging with others, you wonder, like, what is it that happened to this person? Where in the past I would get pissed, have to hold my tongue, maybe say something depending on what they were saying. Now it's kind of like, where's this person coming from and why? Just because I've learned it, just engaging in that fight, just it doesn't get you anywhere. So I'm at that point of curiosity, like what was it that happened to this person that they're at this point where this is what they not want to share. I think just in the emotion of things, this is what they feel they have to do, what they feel they have to say. So it's powerful that you keep bringing that up in terms of what you see today. What's the history of that?
Right.
Where did that come from? What is feeding that? What was provided to it to fire it up? What was kept from it to nurture it? All of that stuff.
So that's why I say it's deeper than emotional intelligence, because I think so many men don't even realize their behavior patterns or the impact that their behavior patterns are having and where it's coming from that place of deep wounding. You know?
Yeah, I mean, that's come up here when people have talked about traumas in their lives or disruption in their lives, however you want to talk about it. And it's pushed me to consider, okay, the quirks of my personality, what triggers me, where does that come from? Tracing that cord back to the wall to see where it originates and reprogramming. You know what I mean? Because you go through life programming based on your experiences. So there's a lot of self-learning that comes from that.
You know, our Project Compassion team, the work we do to deepen compassion in police departments, we had a meeting with Senator Durbin's folks, his staffers, Senate staffers, for the Judiciary Committee. We had a 30-minute conversation scheduled, and it happened that it was scheduled ahead of time, but it happened to be the week after the Uvalde shooting. And in 30 minutes, our conversation revolved around 30-minute conversation, men's mental health, mass shootings, gun violence, police shootings, police suicides, and veteran suicides. And I was like, oh shit, this is the conversation. This is when you know, so many of these things are taken to the extremes, right? And what's often missing, and what really landed for me is what's often missing is hope. When men lose hope, and I think we don't realize where we are today, how many men are on the brink of losing hope. Regardless of what they look like on paper, what's in the bank account, who they're married to, the pressures that men are under. A lot of men are at that brink of hopelessness. And so when I do this work, my philosophy is never I meet men where they are, because I think that can be condescending. And it suggests I'm in a place that they have
to come to where you are. And that's
right. or I'm coming down to where they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's often how I interpret when someone says I meet them where they are. But what I say is I meet men in their suffering. I listen for their yearning, and I offer hope in the midst of both. Because I think more than anything in this work with any man in hypermasculine systems, when I work with extremists on either side, it's being able to instill a sense of hope. And that's probably also what happens as a minister. It's part of my job in my job description, right? So, how do we offer that sense of hope? But also the yearning that folks desire, that men desire. Most of the time, men can't articulate that.
Well, that's what I was saying. When you work with somebody like this in this fashion, there may be people that want to do the work, but they just don't know where to look for the tools. They don't know what to ask themselves.
Right.
I can imagine a lot of them may become open to it. I think so many of us are just kind of in that tunnel vision, cruise control of what it means to be a man, and that's it. And if it's getting tough, if it's getting difficult, then just kind of grit down, bear it, and push forward.
Right.
That you can't show, hey, I need help. You can't, because that is a sign of weakness. There's that programming. And I think all it took was just a few times of hearing it as a kid, and it just stays in your brain. It stays in that programming, and it just kind of compounds as life. As you make your way through life, career, whatever you may have in front of you.
Right.
Incredible.
Well,
Sean,
and that's.
Go ahead.
I just want to say, I just want to reiterate, and folks who've read my book, that what I started seeing the hashtag from folks is wounded, not broken. And that's what if there's one thing I want to just leave folks with, men are not broken. But men very well might be wounded, and more than likely are wounded, or don't realize how wounded they are. In that this is not a philosophy and approach to fix men. It's an invitation for men to get on a healing path, to come into their best selves, to live the life they can't even imagine, to be on an adventure of their own spirit and their own soul, and to make the impact that they have been divinely determined, their divine contribution in the world.
Sean, in writing this book, how did it change you? How did you, obviously, I know you believe everything that you are working in, but even in writing it, did ideas evolve? Did things hit deeper? Did new insights come up as you were writing the book? What changed or evolved in you because of the process of writing this book?
When I wrote the first draft, that was for me. When I wrote this, when I revised it for the book that it is today, then it was for others. But I couldn't look at my book for a year from writing the first draft manuscript to revisions. I pushed it off a couple of times because I wasn't ready. And I still had some healing work to do on myself to be in integrity with my own book. I was very much in the first draft sensationalizing and probably a victim of my own stories. And then when I rewrote the book, it was how can my story help others without sensationalizing my own story? And then it became a guide. It became a roadmap. And so really being able to tease out, what really helped me on the journey to get to where I was by the time the book was published. And at the same time, there were many times when I questioned my own views, especially in a relationship with someone whose views were completely different than mine. And being able to have my book as a reminder for me of what I stand for. and as a reminder of what's important, and that we can get so caught up in the trappings of the human experience of how what success on many levels has been given to us, as opposed to us determining what success is for ourselves. You know, and an opportunity for men to start rewriting their script to the one that is an expression of their authentic truth versus the one that's been given to them by society.
Sean, I know the book relatively recently came out. It was fall of 2023. But what do you think is next for your writing? Are there other areas you think you want to hit?
So I think I'm seeing like a 3-part series. The next book, I want the working title in my head is Unspoken Truth: Deepening Humanity in Hypermasculine Systems. So really, as I work in these systems, what are the stories? As I work in these systems, what are the lever points that can really deepen humanity in police, military, defense, government, finance, tech, energy, construction, these male-dominated environments that haven't been designed to allow for humanity. And so the leadership is really scratching their head as society is expecting, and the next generation is expecting, more humane organizations. Many of these organizations don't know how to adapt. Yeah. Right? And so I think right now it's piecemeal. I don't think it's an integrated approach. And so we might have, a new family leave program. We might have paternity. We might have, unlimited time off. But these are different pieces. But when you think about, okay, but what's the mindset?
Yeah, a lot of what you see nowadays is reactionary
Right.
to something that happens, an event that happens, what the buzzword is in society.
Right.
And so it's reactionary, but there has to be some kind of underlying current that's consistently there, intentionally, proactively.
What if all of your leaders, or your senior leaders held as part of their triple bottom line, or their bottom line, and you're adding in, humanity-based metrics, but really forget the metrics, because I often think right now the metrics are what are our problems.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That we're bringing personal transformation into leadership programs. We're inviting leaders to come into their humanity, and we're asking leaders to lead from a place of their deeper humanity. How would that change the way they engage, the way they inspire, and the way they look at the systems that are in place, and then make, what's important for the business, what's important for the bottom line, what's important for the stakeholders and the shareholders. And at the same time, this goes deeper than any sort of sustainability initiative, which is still based externally.
Yeah.
When you go and do the inner work as a leader, and giving even more attention to men, because I think women and a lot of women's leadership programs offer more access points into the personal growth work. Flip side of it is a lot of men don't have the same access. And men aren't necessarily going to want to go do a weekend retreat where they're getting naked and banging drums. That may not be how they want to do their inner work. And so what are the varieties? But to say it's okay to do your personal growth work as much as your partner, your wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, that we break down the stigmas of this, and we open up accessibility to this, and we let men know that this is available to them. And this will not diminish them as men. It will actually enrich their experience as a human.
Yeah. And it's also great that obviously those men, most of them are going to have younger men in their lives, whether it's their sons, their nephews, family, friends. And I think them doing that work themselves sets the stage for the next generation behind them, the younger generation, to learn those tools, to learn those levers, to learn them at a younger age. You know, I don't know the the average age of a client or the organizations that you work with, but um, again, programming, schooling, you know, they set the curriculum. This is what you have to learn, but it's those life skills that are lacking in those curriculums. Um, but I like the fact that they can set the example for younger men. I mean, my sons are 8 and 5, and there's no reason that I can't set the stage for what they can learn, the questions that they can ask. Again,
Right.
much to like you said, this isn't what you have to look like. This isn't the lesson that I'm teaching you. It's amazing how much I want them to learn just by me asking them questions and getting insightful and getting curious about everything around them. So,
Mhm.
anything that has to do with kind of setting the stage for that generation, because if we needed it in our 40s and we came up most of our life lessons before social media, now you're in that world of instant access, instant connection to everything that's going on. They have additional pressures, I believe, that we didn't quite have. So I hope that that's the case, is that there's this ripple effect through generations from
Right.
whom you're teaching, that they're the younger kids, the younger men are going to pick those up as these positive growth habits.
Well, I really see what you're describing as two-way. Because I think, as I talk to educators, as I talk to parents, and often I hear this next generation is just built differently. They're coming out of the womb differently, you know? And I think from that perspective that there's also a lot that young men can be teaching their fathers and their elders. And that I think what's missing is the intergenerational connection and sense of community that we've had in the past.
Mhm.
It seems to be broken down now, and the generations feel just as divided. If I were to do a bridge building experience, I would do one across generations as well. Because I think there are polarizing ideas of the different generations, and what can be offered, um, down the generations and up the generations.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think in tribal communities, um, you know, from centuries ago, that was key. How the generations played together, and I think that's been up until recent, um, that we've started to see these major disconnects.
Mhm.
You know, someone asked me. I was on another podcast. The man who was, an evangelical Christian, conservative Republican, said to me, Sean, I'm worried about our young men. And but I'm also afraid to share my conservative beliefs because I'm afraid of being canceled or called out. And I said, the fact that you're afraid to share your beliefs is a problem. But I have a caveat to that. What is your intention for sharing those beliefs? Are you sharing them because you want to say that this is the way,
Mm.
or this is a way, or this is the way that worked for me? I think it's important that we share our beliefs and our views and our values and our paths as models of possible ways.
Yeah,
It becomes
absolutely.
problematic when we say this is the way.
Absolutely.
And I think as we share that, we're creating an inquiry with these young men to be more of what is the way that feels right for you
Mhm.
versus what way are you feeling pressured to buy into.
Absolutely. Yeah, because if I think about anybody that I may have a disagreement with, most of the time I'm okay looking at their view. I like reviewing, looking at different views, considering different backgrounds, perspectives, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I think most cases when we look at people that we have disagreements with, even if we're watching them on TV, it doesn't have to be somebody we're talking to. I think most of the time is the way that we're conveying or receiving the message.
Yeah.
We may disagree with their views, but it's the way in which they're delivering the message that really blinds us, I guess.
Yeah.
So that's a good point that you made to him. I mean, what's your message? Are you there to indoctrinate somebody? Are you there to tell them that there is one way, or this is a way? This is a chance. This is an opportunity, an option, or this is what worked for me. And you rarely think about how often you rarely see that said or a message conveyed like that. You don't see it in most of the avenues that we see the exposure we have to, whether it's online, on TV. Rarely is it like that. Everybody comes in with their definitive way that they support. So when those types of messages are shared, that this is an option, this is a way, this worked for me, that's what I wish we could see more of, just because it does welcome more exchange, more engagement.
Right.
Sean, obviously here for your book. If you could pick one book that inspired you, made an impact on you, what book would that be? What stands out for you?
Warrior, Magician, King, Lover.
What is that?
It's a book of and I'm blanking out on the. I think there's two books actually. One, I think that's a beautiful book around the Jungian archetypes that is often used for men's work, and it very much is at the foundation of the Mankind Project and other men's work groups. They really talk about the different roles, the archetypes that we can play as men, and what are we missing, what do we have, what can we activate. And it's a way in that I think can concretize for men an easy and accessible way to see themselves. The other is Bell Hooks' A Will to Love, or Will to Change. But really, I think Bell Hooks provides such a beautiful way of really at the foundation of what I believe. This work ultimately is how to help men learn to love in a new way. And where they, for someone who might not pick up a Bell Hooks book, hopefully they'll pick up Warrior Compassion. And it's just, similar message in some ways, just different entry point and different journey and different examples. But ultimately, I think in a world where we are inundated with messages of fear, what is the way forward for us to be able to access love and unconditional love? And what are the barriers to love? As an interfaith minister, I subscribe to the teachings of Christ, to Sufi wisdom and shamanic practice. And those really are the messages of love and connection to the earth. And really the pursuit of truth.
Yeah, great insights. Yeah. One podcast episode just isn't enough to get all these, just to get that conversation going. I love the awareness you bring to this area of life for men, the work that we need to do for ourselves, first and foremost. So thank you for sharing those books.
Yeah.
Sean, just in wrapping up, what are you up to these days? Is there anything that you want to share with this particular audience? The floor is yours.
I've when I was in California, I gave a talk at it was really sponsored by the American Psychological Association's men's, Division 51 Men and Masculinity Mid-Year Conference. And I was really speaking about, the paradox of compassion for men and boys. And I was doing it with Daniel Ellenberg, Dr. Daniel Ellenberg. But after that talk, I went up the coast and met with 6 companies. So in San Diego, in Los Angeles, and in San Francisco. And so I met with defense contractors, I met with engineering firms, I met with tech firms, I met with a financial services firm, an asset management firm. And basically, I started with, here's my book. Here's the state of men. Men are in crisis on many levels. Men will typically, from my observation, invest more in skill development than in personal growth. So what if we embed personal growth in skill development? And then what I would say, a bit controversial, is in a place we might do this is facilitation, because as a rule, men suck at facilitating. And they would take a moment and then they're like, oh yeah. And when you think about it, as men, we have been conditioned to be great teachers, great lecturers, great presenters, great consultants, great coaches, advisors. But to hold space without ego and make it about the room, that is a stretch for a lot of men. And to really invite all perspectives, to not get triggered, to be able to really create open dialogue that embody emotionality, vulnerability, transparency, and really acknowledging when we get it wrong, and being able to be with our failures and our successes, and to learn from our failures and celebrate our successes and wins. And to really do so, this is an art form, and it's a skill that many men don't have, that many men could use some help refining and elevating. So I positioned a program called Leader as Facilitator, then Leader as Bridge Builder, and then Leader as Change Maker, as a way to bring skill development into organizations and embed personal growth experiences in the ways we facilitate, training leaders, training internal change agents to be able to start bringing deeper humanity into organizational systems. And part of it is what we teach, but more of it is what we embody and how we show up and the presence we bring and the inner work that we have to be able to hold space without the inner turmoil going on. That is an opportunity for leaders. That's an opportunity for all leaders, men in particular, and then also women who have bought into the masculine ideals that success has afforded them in organizations, right? And then those that are outside the binary, and those who are trans, who are trying to figure out their own way as leaders in these systems. So that's really what I'm up to, is being able to bring that forward. And to start telling the stories, the open-hearted, compassionate stories, the heart-opening stories of men, of warriors. And also, then the last piece is also teaching people how to facilitate bridges across polarized divides. And how do we do this in a way that's graceful? How do we do this in a way that's compassionate? And how do we do this in a place that stands for love?
Yeah, it's amazing. Thank you for sharing everything you shared today, Sean. I think the work that you just outlined, that I think there's just so much going on in the world. Again, speaking as a man with a family, middle age, I suppose, it's something that's very important. I think it's something that's needed, not just for us ourselves now and how we navigate the world, but if we do have kids, the way we instill that curiosity in our sons. Again, it's not to take anything away from my daughter, But in this particular case, it is paying that particular attention to, I mean, that's the nature of our conversation, is men and what they need in today's society. So Sean's book is Warrior Compassion: Unleashing the Healing Power of Men. Again, very important conversation, timely conversation. I hope you'll come back for another conversation on one of the books that you chose, Sean. I wish you the best of luck in DC and everything else you do. So thank you for having this conversation with me.
Thanks for having me today.
And if there's anything that I might have missed, there's so much to cover. I feel like we barely scratched the surface, and I've had Sean on here for 1 hour and 40 minutes now. Please reach out, let me know. I'll shoot him an email, see what kind of guidance, wisdom, insight that I can get from him. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
Bye now.